Hi, good morning. My name is Bala, and today we're going to cover a topic called Checklist for every API call. So in this presentation, before we get in there, I want to make the first basic announcements. You can find most of our previous webcasts as well as slides on YouTube and SlideShare channel of Apigee. We also have a fairly good way to interact and continue this discussion on our community. So if you can, please visit community.apigee.com and we can follow up our conversations after this webcast. So my name is Bala and I head up product management at Apigee, and today's topic, as I mentioned, is going to be a checklist for every API call. So to begin this webcast, let's start with Dr. Atul Gawande. Some of you may have heard of him. He's an associate professor at the Harvard Medical School and the Institute of Public Health. He is also a surgeon at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. And the reason we want to start with a renowned surgeon like this is that he was actually one of the leading advocates for a checklist-led initiative at the World Health Organization called Safe Surgery Saves Lives. And this came about through a very interesting concept which he explores in his book. So the book is called a Checklist Manifesto. So when Shankar, who heads up our engineering team, and I got talking about this book, we were brainstorming on what does it mean and how do we think about checklists for like running Apigee operations? How do we think about checklists in terms of all the other activities we do at the company? And then we thought about, more importantly, what would be a great way to talk about checklists for our customers who are really thinking about exposing their mission critical assets using APIs. So we'll get there in a second. But let's start with this book. And the reason I want to give you a preview of this book is it's a very interesting concept. And there are stories in this book about different use cases. So the book starts with a emergency room where a person comes in with stab wounds, and the doctors think it's a routine stab wound, and they feel the patient is stable till they discover that the patient is almost going to die, and they miss something. And then the book ends with a stellar use case of checklist, which is actually Captain Sully Sullenberger landing the plane on the Hudson River, and how the checklist kind of helped in that use case. And the reason I'm kind of giving you that diversity, and there was also a story about what Warren Buffett uses as his investment philosophy and checklist. So there are plenty of examples here in terms of what there are different stories to reinforce this concept of why checklists matter and what you can do with them. So the question obviously you're going to ask is like, okay, how do you take something which is from a surgeon who's probably very knowledgeable, an expert in terms of an operating theater, to something which is all about APIs, where each one of you who's listening to this it has a different role, different function. You may be the actual developer who's doing work on the APIs. You may be the operations team, which is going to manage and make sure that the APIs are up and running. Or you could be the security person in charge of making sure that the APIs are not a front door for breaches to your company's assets. So we'll get there in a bit. But again, to reinforce this point, we have seen checklists being used thanks to this book and what we know for building planes, obviously launching something like a space shuttle. And recently I even found a great article on Harvard Business Review on checklists for better decision making. So there is absolutely a path here which says that there is learning to be had in having a checklist and using it for various scenarios and benefiting from that. Now, I'll grant you this, when I think of checklist, I think most of the people will probably think of this. Something very rigid, which is probably a burden, or something very repetitive and mundane. And there is parts of that statement which are true, but the beauty of the checklist should be that it should be simple, it should get everybody aligned, and more importantly, it should get things done right. If the outcome is going to be all about getting consistently and securely and safely getting stuff done, that is what the checklist is all about. So yes, there is a bit of rigidity, but it's to make sure that you are delivering something consistently and in a safe manner. And that's what we think about when we think about checklist. So now let's get into what does it mean for APIs and where does it begin in terms of a checklist when it comes to APIs. So the first thing I want to start with here is really talk to you about when we think about the API, we are talking about the entire life cycle of an API. And this automatically means that we're going to have multiple people, multiple teams involved. In the way we think about API lifecycle, and we talk to this a lot about this to the customers, is we believe that there is a cycle where people go through designing and developing an API or multiple APIs at the same time. Then depending on the needs, they probably want to really secure that API and then have some sort of a sharing and a publishing mechanism where people can consume those APIs. And then comes the beauty of that consumption kind of delivering value for you, and hence you may want to scale how you deliver that API. And then, of course, you want to make sure that you monitor, you understand, you analyze the data so you can learn from it. And last but not the least, where applicable, you can monetize that API. Now, this entire life cycle is what should be covered and should be part of whatever you're thinking when it comes to API management. And what we want to do is probably start with what does this mean for different teams and who are the teams involved. So there are, in our experience talking to a lot of customers and what we've seen, and of course as Apigee, we have a product and we also use APIs a lot internally to build the product. So we feel that there are at least 4 major constituents when it comes to managing an API lifecycle who will be material in thinking through this checklist. First and foremost is going to be the security folks or the security team. And the reason for this is that invariably when I talk to a lot of customers and we show them the power of APIs and the ability to scale and the ability to do interesting things with their products, the first question they have is, of course, to make sure that there is nothing which is going to be damaging them as a company or their assets. So security becomes a very important thing. The second thing, of course, is the developers or the development team. And again, these could be people who are actually crafting those APIs or the people who are actually building applications, consuming those APIs. But in today's context, we'd probably talk more about the folks who are going to be building those and crafting those APIs. The third part is, as anyone of you who's run something mission critical or in a large scale would know, operations becomes a very, very important thing. And when it comes to API management and checklists, again, we believe that there is a very specific area where the operations folks or the operations team needs to be clear on the goals and objectives and how to safely deliver the APIs for their consumers. And that's something we'll talk about in terms of the checklist as well. The last one is business. Assuming that you're doing all this to have some business advantage and business impact, sometimes it could be just using internal APIs, sometimes it could be using APIs for external consumptions through partners or developers. In either of those cases, there has to be something very specific and useful for the business. And we'll go through some of the checklists which matters to the business teams who are actually helping evangelize or have adoption of these APIs done. So again, to just recap there, the 4 core teams we think about when we think about the checklist for API management or API lifecycle is security, operations, business, and development teams. So with that, let's get started with a bit of detail. And again, my goal here today is not going to be to walk through each of these items. We wanted to make sure that we present this in a manner which is at least driven partially by use case, and we didn't want to dumb it down too much because we know this audience is fairly technical. So we wanted to keep it very real in terms of a technical checklist rather than making it overly simplified English language checklist. But if you prefer to have a better way of thinking about the descriptions for each one of these as we go through, I will have a resource for you at the end of the webcast, and you can download that and you can absolutely take advantage of that. So let's go through some of this. As a security team member, I think there are a few things which probably really matter to you. And the reason of this checklist would be to say, how do you start by thinking through all the possible use cases where security is important? And the reason we want to make this a list which you can think about and then decide what applies or not applies could be dependent on a few factors. One, what kind of an API is that? Number two, who are you exposing this to? Who will have access to it? Is there an automatic restriction for somebody to use these APIs? So all those things kind of get into the mix of things when you decide what you want to do when it comes to this checklist. But the checklist here for a security team member is also easy enough to say which ones you want to do or not do, but not miss anything. And this is the beauty about having a rigid checklist, but not having to do everything depending on your use case scenario, and then making sure that you go follow through that every time so that when the time comes to do the right things for the right APIs, you're not missing anything. So let's go through some examples here. So the common things are obviously we talk about a lot to our customers in terms of is that, hey, do you want to have an API key? Do you want to validate that API key for accessing those APIs? And also make sure that you are logging in responses if you want to, right? The other usual thing we get a lot from our customers is that, hey, what about malicious attacks? And again, you want to make sure that you go through the thinking of, do you want to have enablement which prevent things like SQL injection attacks, or what happens when a compromised API key appears? How do you want to deal with it, or do you have the mechanics to deal with that? Last but not the least, you also want to think about just encryption. And encryption again can be in terms of what data you're storing in the API management tier, and how is it secured, and communication wise, again, are you using something like SSL, either from an originating point where the request is coming from, or from the API management tier to your backend systems. So the reason we want to kind of have this view is that this is fairly holistic in terms of all the things you would want to think through in terms of securing your APIs as a checklist. And again, if some of you read the book, one of the things we always talk about in checklist context is that the checklist is neither an education tool nor an algo for you to go and automate. And third thing, it is absolutely something you want to customize and change depending on the needs of your company or your APIs. So while this is something we have thought through as a fairly exhaustive piece of checklist, you may want to include something which is very specific to your organization, or you may want to take some things out because it doesn't make sense in your context. So that's kind of the aspect on security teams and what their checklist could look like. Now moving on to the development team, again here we're talking about teams which are actually crafting the APIs and building these APIs and then kind of managing them over a period of time. And here again we talk about very classic things like format transformations from XML to JSON or SOAP to REST, but also having a checklist around saying, hey, when do we have to have different kind of implementations when there is a lot more back pressure building up, maybe the backend system is not able to scale, what is the kind of behavior you want, or things like caching, when to implement it, for what do you want to implement caching, or in specific cases where there is sensitive data, do you want to do something around masking or encrypting of data as it goes through the request response, and also things like custom usage tracking, where exactly you're thinking about, I want to really be very specific that if this kind of payload is happening or this kind of developer is doing something, I want to track that usage so I can do some analysis later on that. And continuing on the development team, the other thing we want to talk about is also in terms of the customer call journey or customer user journey. And this is very interesting because sometimes you have users or developers who may be using your APIs and using multiple APIs and multiple resources. Is there a journey you can stitch together? And how do you want to do that? And what's the value of that? And the last but not the least is that we find a lot of our customers using very specific use cases where they may want to do something for storing key value data, or having a document store, or a relational store database. Again, this is to make sure that if there is any kind of persistence of data that you need for your APIs to be functional, do you have that, and how do you make sure that that is available to you as part of the thinking through process of creating and managing those APIs. So that's kind of a good example of what we think about when it comes to the development teams overall. So now we can move on to the next one, which is all about the operations team and how they think about it. And you'll notice now as I go through some of this checklist that some aspects actually are overlapping with either the security team, the development team, or the operations team. And that's by design, because the needs or the way this functions will be different in different organizations. In some companies or some organizations, the decision around what to cache or not cache may be an operations team decision, and the development team may not care much for it. Or it could be a partnership between both the teams. And the reason is, for example, in caching, it could be more about either the response time for the developer who's requesting and using the APIs, or it could be about the scaling of the infrastructure, and that may be the challenge. And when you have this challenge where, for example, your backend systems are not going to scale fast enough, and you want to have something in the API management layer as cache available so that that can scale very easily, then that becomes much more of an operations team decision rather than a developer decision. So you can see why these things can be in multiple checklists. And the fact that we're making sure that it's multiple checklists also is a good advantage, because you will never miss it in the context of overall API lifecycle. And then we have obviously things like rate limits and spike arrest and concurrency limits, because this again goes to prove the point that as an operations team, you're going to be very responsible for making sure that the APIs are running well at scale and serving your customers, which could be the developers who are consuming these APIs, with really good response times. And if they have errors, they are able to log those errors, and the operations teams can take a look at it and say what's happening and fix them quickly. And last but not the least, you also want the operations team to have the ability to do some sort of a progressive rollout. And what I mean by that is, if you're implementing a new infrastructure tier, or you have a new application you've enabled APIs for, you want to make sure that there's a very easy way to roll this out steadily and learn from that. And that means you may be looking at some of the data and saying where are the bottlenecks. It could be a response time bottleneck, it could be a geo issue, and then make sure that you fix them before you go fully deployed and large scale. So again, those are some examples of what we think the operations team might care about from a checklist point of view, and what they may want to go through. And now we'll move on to the last one, which is the business use cases. And here the checklist pretty much is all about thinking through what kind of usage is happening, and then doing some very interesting analysis around that. So in this case, you could do at per caller, per app, per API, per user. So all these metrics are meant to help the business teams understand what value they're driving based on the APIs and the API program. Similarly, they can also implement things which are subscription based, where the entitlements are enforced, and that could be either a very strict limit or a soft limit, and a notification, things of that nature. Or the last one is, again, going back to the call journey or user journey. If there is an end-to-end view of a user traversing through multiple APIs, then you pretty much know, for example, what their behavior looks like. And if it's the same thing from an app perspective, then you know what the app is trying to do, and you can think through, can we make that experience much better for a developer, instead of the developer having to do all that work in making multiple API calls and things of that nature. So the last one, for example, you would have noticed is also available in the development team checklist, and it's also available from a business team perspective. And obviously the goals are very different. The development team would care about making sure that the consuming developer has a fantastic experience with the APIs. And the use case for the business team is more about understanding what is the developer or the app trying to do, and what kind of business problem they're trying to solve, and what is the value for that, and thinking through that problem statement. So again, hopefully you've gotten a good idea in terms of all of these four kind of categories where we talk about API developer, security, operations, and API product owner, and kind of the checklist you want to maintain at a very simple level in terms of use cases. And the goal here is, as I mentioned, the checklist goal is again three things. How do you consistently and securely deliver your APIs and make sure that you deliver them right for the right customer experience or the right audience? So those are the three things which we care deeply about. So again, it applies to the overall API lifecycle. So it's not about one sliver of what we do around the API lifecycle. And that is what we always keep educating our customers in terms of when they're thinking about API management. It is not about just proxying or just doing some basic transformation. You have to think about the overall lifecycle and how you can deliver that. And this checklist is pretty much tuned to the overall API's lifecycle. And more importantly, it's all about delivering the right stuff for your customers. So what we're going to do here is, as we try to wrap this short webcast here, give you one more action here, which is, if you're interested, there is also a very easy read ebook available on apigee.com, and this gives you a little more detail in terms of each of these use cases, what do they mean, and more importantly, what kind of features you're looking for if you're choosing a product. And that's something you can easily download and take it to your teams, and maybe gather up all the right members from your different teams and form your own checklist. And if you have such checklist already existing, or if you're creating one, or you want to kind of seek some help and talk to us or other customers, please join us after this webcast on the Apigee community, where we're going to continue this discussion. And hopefully you will have examples to share, have some great insights for us, and I'm sure we all can learn from each other in terms of what works really well in an organization which has teams like this, and how a checklist can really go a long way in helping deliver the right experience for your developers who are consuming your APIs. With that, we would like to wrap up this session, and thanks again for joining us today for this webcast. And please, let's continue this conversation on community.apigee.com. Thank you very much.